In the entirety of the Second World War, there was perhaps no individual place quite so dark as Auschwitz. It was a death camp, one that claimed the lives of 1.1 million Jews, Poles, Romani, and Soviet POWs by means of gassing, starvation, execution, medical experimentation, and more. The infernal brainchild of Nazi officer Rudolf Höss, Auschwitz ranked among the most brutal expressions of Nazi ideology and gained a reputation for unbelievable, comprehensive cruelty towards the people whose lives Auschwitz was designed to end. Now, to begin today's installment of WarFronts, we're going to ask you to engage in a thought exercise. Take a moment and imagine the Auschwitz concentration camp in all its horror. Imagine the unbelievable pain and suffering that went on there. And now, imagine making the decision to try and stop it, all by yourself, by willfully being captured and interned there in order to carry out your mission. Now, if you can't fathom doing such a thing, if you can't fathom mustering the unbelievable courage it would take to walk into one of humanity's darkest chapters, then we don't blame you. But we also can't compare you to one Witold Pilecki, because that's exactly what Witold Pilecki did. Today on WarFronts, we're going to dig into Pilecki's incredibly daring mission to infiltrate Auschwitz, how he did it, what he experienced inside the camps, how he managed to escape and bring word of the camp to the Western Allies, and how he was rewarded for his trouble with a bullet to the back of the head. By the summertime of 1939, the entire world understood that Europe was on the brink. Nazi Germany's supreme leader Adolf Hitler had long since crossed the Rubicon from a curious, if rather nastily eccentric world leader into a hateful, war-mongering tyrant. And by this time, it had become crystal clear that Hitler's vision for Germany extended far beyond the German border. Outmanned and outgunned in a hypothetical brawl with Nazi Germany, Hitler's next-door neighbors in Poland were dismayed to find that such a brawl wasn't going to be hypothetical for long, and that since the Nazis would likely have the support of Poland's other neighbor, the Soviet Union, it was a brawl from which Poland almost certainly wouldn't emerge victorious. Of course, that didn't mean the Poles were about to back down from a fight. On the contrary, the nation recognized the importance of a valiant defense of their nation, and one that would set a tone for the years of partisan resistance that would follow. Just before we continue with today's video, I've got an exciting thing to share with you. Have you ever Googled yourself and found your personal info out there in the world for all to see? Or maybe you're drowning in spam calls to the point where your phone just feels like some sort of expensive paperweight. Well, look, you're not alone, but I've got a solution, and it's today's sponsor. It's called Aura. That's right, Aura is here to save the day. Data brokers, they are making a fortune selling your info to spammers and robocallers. They know where you live, they know what you had for breakfast. It's like being an unwanted digital stalker. But here's the kicker. Aura can identify these data brokers exposing your info and submit opt-out requests on your behalf. They legally have to remove your info when you ask, but trust me, it is a massive hassle to do it on your own. Let Aura handle it. They're experts. And it's not just about privacy. Aura is also your one-stop shop for online protection. Say goodbye to downloading a bunch of different apps. With Aura, you get parental controls, antivirus, VPN, password management, identity theft insurance, and more, all in one affordable package. Just check out this price comparison and you can see how much you'll be saving with Aura. Let Aura do the heavy lifting of keeping you safe online so you can focus on what you love with peace of mind. So here's the deal. You can either let people continue to exploit you and profit off your information, or you can go to aura.com/warographics to start your 2-week free trial. Also linked below in the description. It is an absolute no-brainer. Thanks to Aura for the sponsorship, and now back to today's video. It was in this most difficult of circumstances that one Witold Pilecki found himself taking up arms in defense of his country. And not for the first time. 38 years old as he stared down the barrel of Nazi Germany, Pilecki had cut his teeth 2 decades prior as a partisan fighter behind Soviet lines after the end of World War I, later fighting for Poland's volunteer army during the Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921. He'd served in the Battle of Warsaw and been present at several of the war's other inflection points, eventually transitioning to a role as an officer after the war's end. A poet and a painter in his spare time, Pilecki had spent the interwar years farming and tending to his family estate while supporting the Polish military as a reservist and possibly as a member of Poland's military intelligence service. He'd been mobilized as the commander of a cavalry platoon just a few days before Nazi Germany's invasion, and at least outwardly, he was more than happy to take up arms in support of his nation no matter the cost. When the war kicked off, Pilecki would do his best to use his cavalry unit to support the Polish infantry, but after the division he was attached to was defeated in the first few days of battle, he broke off and worked in support of a range of other units for as long as he could. From this vantage point, Pilecki witnessed the fall of Warsaw, the rise of the Polish government in exile in Paris, and the invasion of his nation by the Soviets as well as the Nazis. Eventually, the Polish military was forced to capitulate and Pilecki's unit was disbanded, but that didn't mean the end of Pilecki's fight. Instead, he moved underground beside many of Poland's surviving troops and became one of the founding members of the secret Polish army. Far more than just a foot soldier, Pilecki immediately assumed a role at the head of the organization, overseeing its expansion into several of Poland's major cities. Leading a double life as the manager of a cosmetics warehouse, Pilecki served in senior roles across the secret Polish army and worked hard to ensure that the group didn't take too much of an overtly Christian, anti-Semitic, or nationalist tone in order to avoid alienating what allies it had. But before long, Pilecki had found a group that fit more closely with his own vision of what a successful resistance had to be. The Union of Armed Struggle, a resistance organization that counted equal rights for Jews, a mission to document Nazi atrocities, and a responsibility to get information to the Allied powers among its crucial objectives. After some work to convince his colleagues in the secret Polish army, Pilecki was able to merge the two organizations, but as he did, the resistance became aware of a new threat to investigate, a facility of some kind that had cropped up near the town of Auschwitz. The resistance knew its name, Auschwitz, and that it was a place from which people did not return. But they did not know its objective. They figured out that it was some sort of prison or POW camp, and they needed somebody to infiltrate it. According to Pilecki's own statements later in life, he'd been chosen as the man for the job as some sort of punishment for his refusal to support a secret Polish army leader's attempts to push the group towards ultranationalism. But despite the pressure, he agreed to take the job anyway. His mission? Get arrested by the Nazis, try not to get killed, get taken to Auschwitz, figure out what exactly was going on inside, and then find a way out. Pilecki and his allies didn't know it at the time, but the camp they were sending him into was far worse than any ordinary wartime prison. At the time that Pilecki began laying the groundwork for his capture, a year after the invasion of Poland in September 1940, Auschwitz was still being used primarily to detain Polish political prisoners and suspected members of the underground resistance. The first set of prisoners had only been there for a couple of months by the time Pilecki's infiltration began, and the camp was still finding what would become its terrible rhythm. But by the time he arrived, it already housed thousands of souls. Although the facility did already have crematoriums operational, they weren't yet intended for mass murder, but rather in the disposal of bodies of prisoners who had died by other means. All told, the Auschwitz Pilecki was walking into was already a despicable place, but it hadn't yet evolved into the death camp that it would become. That transformation was one that Pilecki would watch from a front row seat. The moment came on the 19th of September 1940, when Pilecki ensured that he was present at a street intersection in Warsaw for what would be the second in a long series of street rounds-up of Poles carried out by the Nazi SS. Pilecki was known to have been captured using the name and identification papers of Tomasz Serafiński, a Pole who was, by that time, assumed to be already dead. It wasn't, but Pilecki didn't know that at the time. After his capture, he was transported to Auschwitz with about 1,700 other prisoners. In his reports after the fact, Pilecki described having been annoyed by his fellow Poles, who seemed to go almost passively into the maw of whatever the Nazis had waiting. About the moment he arrived at the camp, Pilecki penned the following for his final report. I consider this place in my story to be the moment when I bade farewell to everything I had hitherto known on this earth and entered something seemingly no longer of it. Pilecki, like any other prisoner arriving at Auschwitz, was immediately set upon by spotlights and SS soldiers swinging the butts of their rifles. He and other arrivals were forced to watch one man be told to run to a post a few meters away, be followed with automatic weapons fire, and quickly mown down. As punishment for that man's actions, which he'd been instructed to perform by the SS, 10 other men were selected at random and shot. The corpses were mutilated by dogs and dragged behind the prisoners for all to see. After that first demonstration by the Nazis, they were given prison clothing, photographed, and assigned a prisoner number: 4859 for Pilecki. As Pilecki told it, the two 13s of his number, made by adding together the outer numbers and adding the inner numbers, were taken as a bad omen by his fellow prisoners, although he found himself a wry bit of amusement in it. He and his fellow arrivals were given a brief explanation of why they'd been brought to Auschwitz. According to the guards, they were a gang of Polish bandits who'd been attacking peaceful Germans. So too did they receive a grim warning from the camp's then deputy commandant, Fritz Seidler. He said, Let none of you imagine that he will ever leave this place alive. It has been worked out that you will survive for 6 weeks. Anyone who lives longer must be stealing, and anyone who is stealing will be sent to the penal colony where you won't live very long. But after the chilling ordeal of his arrival, after he was shaved head to toe and had his front teeth knocked out, and after he'd met the fellow prisoner who would brutally keep order on his own cell block, a German known as Bloody Alois, Pilecki got to work. His first few days were spent figuring out some essential rules to survival in the camp. Avoid excess liquid consumption in order to not develop edema. Keep clean feet to avoid beatings in the evening hours. Stay at the center of every pack rather than fighting for what limited food and water there were. And never, ever miss roll call. And then he turned his mind to resistance. Happy to find that those same docile Poles who had seemed to accept their fate at first were now starting to get angry. To quote, "I felt that finally we were all united by the same anger, a desire for revenge. I felt myself in an environment perfectly suited to begin my work here and discovered within me a semblance of happiness, above all because I wanted to start work, and so I had not cracked." Pilecki's main objective was to set up an organization within the camp, uniting prisoners into a system where they could receive news from the outside world, distribute extra food and clothing to those who needed it, and get information out of the camp whenever possible. Underlying all that, there was also another mission, to lay the groundwork for the moment that help eventually arrived, so that the prisoners could be ready to take over the camp and help with an Allied assault. His plan was to arrange prisoners into cells of 5 men, each of which knew nothing of the other cells and had the mission to build a network as if they were sitting at the head of an internal resistance operation. That way, in the event that one such cell was to be sniffed out and annihilated, they would have no ability to give up the other cells inside the camp. Of course, Pilecki risked an incredibly painful death if he trusted the wrong inmates with that sort of responsibility and was sold out to the guards, but luckily for him, he had plenty of other resources within the camp, specifically other members of the Polish resistance who had been rounded up and were known to be trustworthy. From a group of 25 resistance fighters, Pilecki was able to create 5 cells, which each developed on their own for a while before eventually starting to run into each other. When this did take place, the person bringing that news to Pilecki would generally get the equivalent of a pat on the head and a "don't worry about it." For him, keeping that sort of wry, impossibly optimistic sense about him was integral. After all, how could he ever hope to inspire the prisoners in his network if he himself faded into despair? All the while, Pilecki was watching the goings-on of the camp, not just as an academic observer, but as someone who was as much a prisoner at Auschwitz as anybody else. Forced to work, crushing manual labor amidst death, torture, and disease, Pilecki was more able than most to navigate the ins and outs of the camp, partly owing to his military training and experience, and partly because of his physical hardiness relative to the other people interned there. More than once in his writings, Pilecki discussed the people who'd been doctors or lawyers or served other roles in society that had demanded no exertion of their bodies or survivalist instinct of the mind. Invariably, Pilecki documented the extraordinary pain they experienced at Auschwitz, even relative to the other prisoners. He also emphasized the sheer number of deaths on a daily basis, often the deaths of people that had come to know and respect, only to haul their dead bodies back to roll call at the end of the day. Pilecki's first big break came in December of his first year, when he was able to charm his way into an indoor job as a carpenter. Not only did this get him out of the camp's most dangerous forms of forced labor, but it gave him the opportunity to recover the strength that he would need to run a resistance network, increase his chances of survival, and give him a place to think in peace. And with a role that demanded he complete numerous jobs around the camp, Pilecki was able to find his way into restricted zones like the hospital and be a fly on the wall for conversations that his camp superiors didn't care if he overheard. Thanks to the extra food he was able to collect while in his position and his renewed strength compared to the ordinary Auschwitz prisoner, he was able to survive a bout with pneumonia and continue forward. All the while, he was writing, taking notes, compiling reports, and smuggling them as best he could until he could figure out how to get one out. Occasionally, as in the case of one of his allies named Tadek Bursky, somebody he trusted would be released from the camp after family or friends found some way to get them out. When they left, it would be with immensely valuable intelligence on their person. Another prisoner in Pilecki's network had been chosen to work in a nearby town and was able to establish lines of communication with the locals who would send letters that would eventually make it to the Polish underground's high command. A third was released from the camp with the help of a college friend who had become a German military officer, and when the inmate, one of Pilecki's most trusted associates, found his way out, he carried a substantial report back to Warsaw. Running so many parallel networks in the camp demanded constant work, not least to replenish the cells quickly in order to compensate for the high daily death tolls of the people there. However, members of Poletsky's cells generally had a better chance of survival than most, not just because they had some measure of purpose to keep themselves from complete despair, but because in addition to their intelligence work, the cells organized the capture and distribution of stolen scavenged food. As the cells grew, the prisoners among their number were able to slowly take over certain work detachments, giving themselves some degree of safe haven even when they were assigned the most brutal forms of work. Often Poletsky found himself in the position of mediator, trying to force collaboration between Poles who had been political enemies in the outside world. In his own words, one had to show Poles daily a mountain of Polish corpses in order for them to reconcile. Then there were Poletsky's efforts to worm his way upward through the camp structure, including to the Auschwitz guards. At the camp, the torture of inmates was not optional for the guards. It was expected that they would regularly and proactively participate in the beatings and manual punishment of their prisoners, and those who chose not to engage in those particular methods had better find some other way to express their sadism. Failing to do so, or refusing to take part in the torture at all, was tantamount to treason against the Nazi state, and the guards, being prisoners themselves, were thus opened up to the entire world of pain from which they'd been spared thus far. But Poletsky could still see that some guards engaged in it unwillingly or looked for ways out of the violence when possible. Several such guards eventually fell under Poletsky's sway, although by and large none of them had any idea of the existence of a broader underground movement. Instead, they would be approached by specific members of a cell who would request help for a friend or some support with a personal matter, and generally they'd be willing to help out. Sometimes that meant assigning certain inmates to a certain work group. Other times it was to ensure that prisoners who were having a hard time surviving their outdoors work were moved indoors. Other guards found ways to get second portions to particularly exhausted prisoners, while still others attempted to make the camp hospital at least a little less fatal for those who were sent there. One, in particular, made sure not to stand in the way of prisoners who made contact with the outside world, and before long, that guard was even helping to facilitate contact with other members of the Polish resistance, although it's unclear whether he understood the full scope of what he was doing. What was perfectly clear, though, is that the guard withstood a brutal beating from the camp overseers after failing to notice that locals were providing extra bread to the inmates, and even after that punishment, the guard showed no intent to stop helping his fellow prisoners. During this time, Poletsky cheated death on numerous occasions, by sweet-talking enraged camp guards in just the right way to avoid being shot over a minor slight, by battling through pneumonia, as we mentioned before, and by happening to be summoned to an SS administrative office on the same day that several of the other inmates on his block were led away to be executed. When a person recognized him from Warsaw and addressed him with his real name rather than the false one he had come under, he was lucky enough to be surrounded exclusively by trusted allies. When it happened a second time, one inmate had overheard, who was completely unknown to Poletsky, but that inmate would eventually join the ranks of the underground cells. Perhaps most critical of all, he was repeatedly passed over when a camp supervisor selected the craftsman who would build the neighboring Birkenau concentration camp, a decision akin to receiving a death sentence. He also caught other lucky breaks more than once. Mass transfers of new Polish civilians into the camp, while obviously devastating for those civilians, would invariably deposit a few more members of the Polish resistance into Poletsky's lap. He found his way into the horse stables, where inmates had figured out how to make something resembling a cake and could drink horse milk to sustain themselves. Now, it's worth taking a moment just to emphasize how fragile this entire structure was. Leaders of cells were recruited almost exclusively on Poletsky's personal judgment of their character, with no wiggle room to trust the suggestions of cell members that he didn't know well. Trust was everything. If it were misplaced just once, Poletsky and an entire cell might have been found out, or if the wrong few people had broken under interrogation, the entire thing could come collapsing down. Somehow, by the same inescapable luck that seemed to have surrounded Poletsky thus far, he chose correctly every time, and never once was sold out by a single person under his networks of command. Things in the camp grew more strained in August of 1941, when shortly after the outbreak of war against the Soviet Union, the first mass gassings of camp inmates began. At first, these were used only on a handful of Soviet POWs, but by November, Poletsky was witnessing columns of hundreds of Soviet prisoners stripped naked and ushered into the crematorium. Within a couple of months, this treatment was no longer reserved for the Soviets, who had come in large numbers unexpectedly and who the SS had wanted to deal with quickly. 1942 was even worse. Not only did gas execution rates skyrocket, especially against Jews in the camp, but camp authorities began to post mailboxes where prisoners could provide tips and anonymous disclosures. Luckily, Poletsky and his network were able to crack open these boxes and take out any problematic tips while not obstructing the ones that might get rid of their own enemies. The camp also weathered increased rates of disease, especially typhus brought in by Soviet prisoners. Here too, Poletsky and some of his associates tried to take advantage of the outbreak, cultivating infected lice and releasing them onto the coats of SS officers whenever they could. The effort proved successful, with many SS men killed as a result. As 1942 wore on, the SS began zeroing in on possible resistance members, and Pilecki began making his own preparations for the network to survive in the event of his death. As he did, the resistance reached higher numbers than ever, with well over 100 operatives inside Auschwitz that Pilecki personally kept track of, and probably more who he hadn't encountered. In February of that year, Pilecki had another breakthrough, finally accumulating the parts to cobble together a radio transmitter. Once it was operational, the resistance used it to broadcast details about the number of new arrivals and camp deaths, and explain the state of the camp and the inmates there. Although the SS could hear the reports on the radio, they proved unable to find the source of the transmissions. On other lines of communication, run through in-person contact with the locals, the resistance was able to receive anti-typhus medication and send out German cipher keys. As conditions got tougher, Pilecki endured a bout of typhus himself, but took his weeks of recovery as an opportunity to focus on organizing his resistance military action. By October 1942, the camp's resistance was organized into 4 battalions, each with several platoons of men underneath them, and unified under a single military commander, one of Pilecki's close allies. At all times, 1 battalion was kept on duty, ready to drop everything at a moment's notice if a signal came to strike. All the SS guards' keys had been stolen and copied, and even some of the guards themselves had made clear that they'd be on the inmate side in the event of a riot. By this point, as Pilecki himself wrote, "For some months now, we have been able to take over the camp on more or less a daily basis. After all, the prisoners at Auschwitz had been so worn down for so long that all the Nazis believed they needed to control them was a handful of small watchtowers and a squadron of SS enforcers. But without any support to hold the camp once it was captured or get everyone out of Nazi-controlled territory safely, there was little use in taking it over." For the rest of 1942 and into 1943, things only got worse. Medical doctors and students descended on the camp, carrying out human experimentation, something that Pilecki's organization made sure to investigate, but were horrified to have to learn about once they understood what was taking place. More and more inmates were being shot, not at random, but because of accusations that they were beginning to organize, and in general, the SS began gaining aptitude as sniffer dogs trying to root out Pilecki's spiderweb of allies. Thousands of Poles were removed from the camp entirely and sent elsewhere in attempts to shake up whatever networks did exist. On the bright side, inmates were allowed for the first time to receive small parcels of food, which arrived in crushing amounts once families on the outside got word of their opportunity to help their loved ones. But even this was small consolation in a place where incredible human depravity was still finding new ways to reveal its darkest nature. For Pilecki, the question of escape was one that he would have to face eventually. Smuggled letters could only convey so much, or could have been altered, but Pilecki's testimony and detailed intelligence presented in the flesh could prove crucial to liberating the camp. But escape also came at a high cost. Beginning in the spring of 1941, the Auschwitz guards instituted a policy that would see 10 prisoners shot for every one that escaped, a harsh reality that changed Pilecki's own outlook on the matter. As he wrote when the policy came into effect, "At that time we, as an organization, took a clear position against escapes. We organized no escapes and opposed any thought of them as evidence of extreme egoism until there were major changes in this area. For the time being, all escapes were lone ventures having nothing to do with our organization." But that changed in February of 1942 when orders came down from Nazi high command that Auschwitz's policy to kill 10 for every escapee had apparently prompted reprisals in Allied camps. And when a year later the SS threatened to bring escapees' families to Auschwitz as punishment and displayed 2 doomed women as an example, they were found out for having selected random women from the nearby camp of Reiskow. This meant that escape was now on the table, and it was sorely needed at a time when the wanton brutality of the camp's early years had been replaced by something almost worse, a cold, clinical, processional effort to end lives at an astonishing rate. Adding to the risk, infiltrators had started to pop up, collaborators sent into the camps to try and join, then expose resistance networks on behalf of the SS. Early escapes consisted of small pockets of resistance associates carrying out Pilecki's reports, including one group of 4 that managed to steal and don SS uniforms and escape in the camp commandant's car. And of course, if you'd like a separate story on that particular feat, do tell us in the comments below and we'll be sure to oblige. Others made mass escape attempts when they were selected for particularly harsh forms of internment, with a small handful successfully getting out in exchange for the lives of dozens of their comrades. In Pilecki's case, his first idea came via the sewers. Pilecki's friends in Auschwitz's construction office had been able to procure a map of the camp's sewer network, from which he had charted the best entry and exit points. But this plan proved too risky, and he set to work on finding another route. As he did so, he encountered a prisoner called Jasiak, who he chose as an ally, and together they formed a plan to escape through the Auschwitz bakery while working a night shift. After they got Jasiek assigned to the bakery, he was so successful and well liked by the floor boss that he was made into a deputy supervisor and given the run of the night shifts. Then Poletsky himself feigned typhus, thus getting assigned to the quarantine block where he was helped by a couple of members of the resistance. He extended one of them, a 20-year-old named Edik, who had come to Auschwitz barely a man, an opportunity to join him, and Edik quickly accepted. The young Pole threw what amounted to a temper tantrum against his current boss, only to graciously accept a transfer to the bakery. He brought a transfer card for Poletsky too. When the time for their night shift came, they were just barely able to time their escape to avoid the bakery guards, who spotted their departure but were unable to find a clean shot with their sidearms. After days spent fleeing through the countryside, dodging civilians, relying on the help of a few seemingly trustworthy strangers, and getting shot in the shoulder while running from a German soldier that they'd stumbled upon, Poletsky and his associates were able to make it to one of their Auschwitz's allies' own parents. And in one last incredibly strange twist of fate, when it came time for that elderly couple to put Poletsky in touch with the local commander from the Polish undergrounds, the person Poletsky encountered was one Tomasz Serafiński. That was the exact name and identity that Poletsky himself had been using during his years in Auschwitz, after Serafiński's papers had been provided to him under the false assumption that the man had died. Poletsky chronicled this rather exceptional conversation in his writing, stating, "I introduced myself with the name I had used in Auschwitz, and he replied, 'I'm also Tomasz,' he said in surprise." Leon listened to this exchange in astonishment, as did the man's wife. "But I was born here." I now proceeded to name the day, year, and month, which I had repeated so many times in Auschwitz at every change of block or command, and for the notes drawn up by the capos. The man always leapt from his chair. "What's going on here? Those are my personal details." "Yes, they are, but they've gone through far more with me than with you." Poletsky would end up staying for months with the real Tomasz, forming a resistance unit with the goal of attacking and liberating Auschwitz, while writing several of his contacts to update on his status and the status of the camp. He was lucky enough to miss a visit from the SS, who spoke to the real Tomasz and immediately dismissed him as someone who had had his identity stolen, and eventually he made his way to Warsaw, presenting his plans for a liberating operation. In the course of his own work, he wrote his final report on Auschwitz, which was incredibly helpful in writing this video, and which is available for public consumption. It chronicles his experiences in the camp in detail, not just what he saw, but how he had made the people there ready to resist. The first page, in an incredibly understated admission of the gravity of what he'd seen, read in part as follows: "I am to write down the driest of facts, which is what my friends want me to do. They have told me, the more you stick to the bare facts without any kind of commentary, the more valuable it will be. Well, here I go. But we were not made out of wood, let alone stone, though sometimes it seemed as if even a stone would have broken out in a sweat. One was not made of stone, though I often envied it. One still had a heart beating, sometimes in one's mouth." After he found his way back to the resistance, Poletsky joined up with a sabotage unit while coordinating the resistance inside the camp as best he could from afar. In that double role, he participated in the Warsaw uprising, first as a common soldier under a false identity, and then, when too many officers were killed for the operation to sustain itself, he came forward to take command of a battalion himself. In the lead up to the uprising, he'd also become a member of an anti-communist secret organization, fully expecting that when the Nazis finally fell, he and his resistance would have to pivot and oppose the Soviet Union, rather than taking much more than a day off. His role there was to put together a structure of people to plan a combat operation in the event that they were indeed forced back underground. But the Warsaw Uprising was no kinder to Poletsky than it was to any other Pole. Despite good success with his own unit, Poletsky was powerless to stop the collapse of the broader insurgency, and in October of 1944 he was taken captive and sent to the POW camp called Murnau. In his time there, he lay far lower than he'd done at Auschwitz, mostly taking care of young freedom fighters who had never been in such a situation before. When he was let out, it was because the camp had been liberated, not because of any daring escape on his part. By then, Auschwitz had been liberated, and not by a Polish operation. And it's here that we've got to take a moment to acknowledge that despite the incredible value of Poletsky's acts inside Auschwitz, despite the countless lives he undoubtedly saved by orchestrating the delivery of food and resources and hope, and despite the contents of his report, his ultimate goal inside Auschwitz was never realized. The cavalry, the Polish winged hussars, never came to liberate the camp, something that instead had to come by way of the Soviet Union. How Poletsky himself felt about that, it's difficult to say, although it seems like a fair bet, at least on paper, to imagine that the good he did in the meantime was more than enough to make his ordeal with it worth it. After the war's conclusion, Pilecki was briefly dispatched to Italy to convalesce, where he wrote his memories out and worked with Polish military commanders about what would come next. By December of 1945, he was back in Poland, this time under another false name. But this version of Poland, while thankfully unlike the one that had been occupied by Nazi Germany, was nonetheless unrecognizable from the nation where Pilecki had spent his early adulthood. With Soviet secret police and their local militias taking over, the anti-communist organization Pilecki had joined had been dissolved, but its former leaders were hard at work, spawning guerrilla units and widely scattered cells that were trying hard, but not always successfully, to stay a step ahead of the Soviets. In this environment, Pilecki built a new network from the ground up, calling on his surviving contacts and cobbling together an intimate knowledge of the Soviet regime. At the same time, he devoted significant personal resources to the compilation of memories and accounts of the Auschwitz resistance, frustrated by fabricated stories that Soviet propagandists were spreading about the camp. But before long, he'd received word that his identity had been uncovered by the Soviets. Faced with the decision to leave Poland and his family, as well as leaving his resistance network with no suitable replacement at its head, Pilecki resolved to stay for as long as he could. As long as he could. Well, that turned out to be the 8th of May 1947, when Pilecki was taken into custody by communist authorities. Kept in isolation from his fellow prisoners, Pilecki was interrogated by a pack of Soviet secret police known for their brutality, who tortured him for 6 long months and elicited a number of forced confessions and endorsements of statements that the Soviets had prepared. But even in this most impossible of circumstances, Pilecki still managed to avoid revealing any sensitive information. In March of 1948, Pilecki was convicted of espionage, conspiracy to assassinate Polish officials, and a number of other charges in what amounted to a show trial. 2 months later, he was sentenced to death. This was despite pleas to the communist regime from many Auschwitz survivors. On the 28th of May 1948, a Soviet agent named Pyotr Smetensky did the one thing the Auschwitz concentration camp never could. He executed Witold Pilecki with a gunshot to the back of the head. The location of his burial is still unknown, although today he's memorialized in several locations across Poland. In one last blow to Pilecki's work, his writings and accounts of what happened in Auschwitz would be suppressed for decades after his death in order to prevent his example from being used to inspire further resistance. It wasn't until the 1990s, after the fall of communism in Eastern Europe, that Pilecki's efforts were finally revealed to the world. In the years since, he's posthumously been honored with Poland's highest decoration, the Order of the White Eagle, and commemorated all across his country in monuments and media. To this day, he's believed to be the only person to ever voluntarily enter Auschwitz as an inmate, and it is truly impossible to quantify the continued results of his work in the descendants of people who would not have survived without him. What can be quantified is the simple fact that Witold Pilecki was one of one. When faced with one of the most darkest and most apocalyptic places that humanity has ever created, he, and he alone, chose to look it in the eye and force it to back down first. He was a man who did the unthinkable, whether for love of country, love of freedom, or perhaps, most likely of all, love of humanity. He may not have been the spy that liberated Auschwitz, but he was the spy who brought word of it to the whole world, from inside a place no other person would ever have dared to go.